Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session of Online with LSE. I'm happy to be here with you today to talk about an interesting article that was published by Dr. Lisa McDonnell on identifying troublesome jargon in biology. And as a reminder, the goal of this webinar series is to provide a behind-the-scenes look or insight into education scholarship. So Lisa is going to first give a brief overview of the article for those who haven't had a chance to read it, or for those who did read it and just need a little refresher. And as you listen, I strongly encourage everyone to submit questions as we go using the Q&A feature. So please don't use the chat, we're using the Q&A. And so with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa, who's going to talk about her work on identifying troublesome jargon in biology. Lisa.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, and thank you for having me here today. Ashanti, thank you for getting all this online and organized, and as well as thank you to your team. Great, so I'm just going to get started with my brief overview. To do that first, I want to acknowledge the team effort that went into this. Primarily my collaborators, Megan Barker, who's at Simon Fraser University, and Jenna Zuxwert, who is currently at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So we did this work together at the University of British Columbia, and it really wouldn't have happened unless all of us were working on it to come up with the idea. And then Jenna was really instrumental in the data analysis and helping us see the stories emerge in our data. And we had some funding from Skylight Development Grant at UBC, and then of course a huge team of instructors that collaborated with us to identify jargon in their classes and do the surveying. And so I'm currently at the University of California, San Diego in biological sciences. And so when we're talking about jargon in biology, I want to first emphasize that what we mean by this is technical vocabulary terms that are used in the discipline and the meaning of which that might not be intuitive to novices. And we know that learning discipline-specific concepts and the technical vocabulary that represents them is required to achieve fluency in a scientific discipline. And we also know that there's lots of jargon in science. And when we're teaching and learning in science and in biology, we're often asking students to learn the concepts as well as a language. And maybe we're not always as explicit about the need to learn that language, the language of biology. So we first became interested in this relationship between jargon and learning and this language component of learning after encountering an article by Brian Brown and Ryu published in 2008 called Teaching Science as a Language, a Content-First Approach to Teaching Science. And from their work in middle school students, they disaggregated concepts and jargon, and they found improved conceptual understanding. And Megan Barker and I, in collaboration with Carl Wyman, did a similar study in higher education settings showing that disaggregating concepts and jargon improved students' use of correct arguments and explanations. And this suggested that there's a role for jargon in learning, that maybe initially when students are learning new concepts at the same time as the jargon, it could potentially reduce their conceptual understanding. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be related to the cognitive load of trying to learn all those things at the same time. So after doing this study related to disaggregating concepts and jargon to try and improve learning, we still had some questions. And so that led us to the current study that I'm here to discuss today. And really our main question was, well, what makes a term jargon? We felt that maybe from the previous study, we had maybe been a little biased about what we think is problematic jargon. So we were making our best guess in collaboration with the instructors based on their experience and our own experience working with students. Well, we think these particular terms are hard, so let's target those. But we really wanted to explore this from a different perspective, in particular collecting it from students. So for this study, our goal was to gain a better understanding of what constitutes problematic technical vocabulary. And we had 3 questions that we wanted to answer. What types of technical vocabulary terms do students struggle with the most? For example, terms that are familiar to them, terms that represent abstract things, or terms that have multiple meanings in different disciplines or multiple meanings in what we might consider everyday language and science language. What is the degree of alignment between students' perceived understanding and their performance at defining the terms? Do they have an accurate assessment of their own understanding? And are there common errors that students have when they're trying to define these different terms? That might help us learn a bit more about where they're struggling with these different technical vocabulary terms and how we can support them to learn them. So to investigate these 3 questions, we collected data in the form of a survey from students in 2 large biology courses. One was cell biology, one was genetics. We had a list of 72 terms that we came up with in collaboration with the course instructors. And we released a survey to the students, and we got a little over 1,000 responses that we could analyze once we filtered out the ones that we couldn't analyze from 272 different students. And on this survey, it was pretty short. We were asking them 3 questions. So they were randomly given a subset of these 72 terms. And they were first asked, when they were presented with the term, do you recognize it? Yes or no? Do you think you know what it means? Yes or no? And then provide a definition for the term. And we used their responses to question 2 to analyze or to make an assessment about their perceived understanding. And then we used their definition that they provided to assess performance. So we scored them for correctness. And then we compared the performance and perceived understanding to see about the degree of alignment between those 2. We also looked at the definitions they provided for common errors. So for these 72 terms, we actually we grouped them into categories. And the categories were incompatible ambiguity, which I'm going to refer to as ambiguous terms moving forward. And these are terms that have a use in everyday English vernacular as well as in biology, but those uses might be slightly or quite different. Information terms, descriptions of transfer of information, molecular terms, organelles, practice, so relating to the practice of science, and processes. And what we found was that the perceived understanding across the 72 terms from students varied from 0 all the way to 100%. And there was only one term that none of the students said they felt they understood it, and that was epitope. Another term that was quite low on the ranking of perceived understanding was assay, and that was 23% of students said they thought they understood it, and the rest did not. In general, though, students' reported understanding was fairly high. The average across all terms was 81%. When we looked at the perceived understanding, the mean percentages for the different categories, we found that molecular was the lowest or the least understood from the perspective of the student, with an average of 68% of the terms reporting to be understood by students. And information and incompatible ambiguity terms had the highest perceived understanding, 91%. And so this lowest perceived understanding was significantly different from all the other terms, and the highest perceived understanding for ambiguous and information was also significant from all other terms. So we chose to focus on those 3 moving forward. So next we looked at performance, and we wanted to compare that to their perceived understanding. So first, just in terms of performance, when we looked at the correctness of the student provided definitions, we found that molecular terms, information terms, and ambiguous terms, the average percent correct was about 40%. And that's when we looked at completely correct definitions. The ambiguous terms had the lowest in terms of percent of definitions that were completely correct. That was about 30%. And molecular had the lowest when we considered both completely correct and partially correct responses. That was about 60% when we merged those 2 together. Molecular terms also had the most unanswered, where students just didn't provide a definition. So then when we started to compare correctness or performance to perceived understanding, if we look at information and molecular, for example, there was about 40% completely correct definitions provided by students for terms in both of those categories, but significantly different perceived understandings, where 68% of students said they understood the molecular terms and 91% said they understood the information terms. So this led us to start to wonder, are students in general overestimating their understanding for some of the terms and less so for others? And so that's what we're looking at here then. We plotted the percent thought understood on the bottom to the percent correct for the definitions, and this is completely correct, for terms that fell into the molecular category, open circles, the information category, closed circles, and terms that fell into the incompatible ambiguity category, the plus symbol. And what we can see here is that in general, students under or overestimated their understanding. So they had higher percent thought understood, but a much lower percent correct when we actually scored them. And this was especially true for terms that fell into the categories of information and incompatible ambiguity. We can see the molecular terms are approaching this line here, which would represent an accurate perceived understanding with correct, where they've assessed themselves correctly. So in general, they're better at assessing their understanding of molecular terms. And just to put some context here, so sometimes people ask, well, what are these different terms? So these terms here where we had fairly low percent thought understood and quite low percent correct were activator and centromere. Here we have some terms from the ambiguous category that had really high percent thought understood, high perceived understanding, and quite low correct scores when we checked the definitions they provided. And then here we have some terms from the information category, again, really, really high perceived understanding and not so high correctness scores when we assessed the definitions they provided. So that's just really a quick brief overview of the study. And we really took away from this that jargon is quite important, as we know, but we shouldn't always assume what students know and don't know. And maybe we shouldn't take for granted that we need to actually include this in a lot of our instruction. Maybe we're overlooking some of that in our instruction. And I'd like to just open it up for questions then. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. So first, let's get into a few methodological questions. So I'll start with the Q&A ones first. They seem to be pretty brief. So were the answers to the definitions free response?
Yes, they were free response. So students were just asked to provide a definition for the term to the best of their ability.
And what was the averaged correct compared to?
So we had definitions based on how they would have been used in the course and in the course textbook. Mm-hmm. With the exception of one term, adaptation, we had a correct definition based on the evolutionary biology use of the term that we realized was different than the way some of the instructors were using it in the course. So there was a difference there.
Okay. And then for the ambiguous terms, was it made clear to the students what context they should define the term in?
It was not. So they accessed the survey through their course learning management system. So the context may have been implied, like, hey, you're accessing this through your genetics course, but it wasn't explicitly stated. They would have read a blurb at the beginning talking about, we're interested in jargon in biology, but again, it wasn't explicitly stated.
Do you think that molecular terms are perhaps intrinsically more difficult to define, leading to lower perceived understanding? So for example, a non-molecular term like model or adaptation has a rich conceptual meaning, whereas tubulin or ligand seems less conceptually rich.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do think, I would like to think that has something to do with it. We haven't studied that. So previous studies on learning different types of language have shown that when students can make meaning of things, that they have a better time, or they're more successful at using those terms and retaining what they mean. So having that connection to it in some way. So if, the concept is deeper and you have more connections to it in your knowledge frameworks, then maybe it's easier to understand.
Mm-hmm. And then this next question was included in the article, but just as a recap, how was correctness of a definition determined?
So based on the definitions that we as a team had agreed on, okay, here's a model correct definition. Then we scored the definitions that student provided on really a 3-point scale. So incorrect, partially correct, where maybe they had half of the definition there, and then completely correct. They had all the components that made the correct definition.
Okay. And then Switching over to one of my questions. So in the study, you analyzed the percentage of students who believe that they understood words from 6 categories, right? These were jargon categories, molecular, process, practice, organelle, incompatible, ambiguity, and information. And then you took the lowest thought understood category, which is molecular, and then the 2 highest thought understood categories, incompatible, ambiguity, and information. To assess the extent to which students were able to correctly define these terms. Can you discuss your rationale behind choosing to focus on the lowest thought understood category and then the 2 highest thought understood categories, as opposed to assessing correctness across the 6 categories?
Yeah, so when we look at the mean correctness across all the categories, as you said, molecular was lowest, it was about 68%, and the 2 top were about 91%. And then the next 2 highest after that were very close to the 91%, but they weren't statistically significantly different from all the others. And so we use the statistical significance as sort of a cutoff, like, hey, maybe these are worth pursuing first. Also, the other 3 categories in the middle had the lowest number of terms in them. So we thought, moving forward, if we're trying to code them and look for patterns, it might be better to have a higher number of terms in those categories. And then, just practically speaking, in terms of coding all the definitions, over 1,000 of them, when we narrowed it down to just those 3 terms, we chose to pursue those. But we really wanted that contrast of the lowest perceived understood and the highest perceived understood. And going into the study, we were quite curious about these terms that fell into the ambiguous category and wondered, are those problematic for students because they get used in different ways depending on the situation. So we had a desire to pursue those, and it turned out that they were statistically significantly higher perceived than the other. So using our statistical cutoff to decide which to pursue, then it worked out that we got to include it.
Yeah, great. And then the article stated that instructors promoted the survey as a good opportunity for students to test themselves on key technical vocabulary terms before the exam and then participate in the research study, but there were no additional incentives awarded for participation or correctness. So I was curious, how, if at all, do you think the results of the study would be different or the same if students' performance on defining the terms were tied to an incentive, such as a score on a quiz or an exam?
Yeah. I do think that the correctness scores would on average go up a little bit. I think we'd see, definitely less unanswered if there were points attached to it. And so maybe that would bump up the partially correct scores a little bit. And then I'm sure some of those partially correct scores would, if students are putting in a bit more effort, incentivized by points, we might see more the correctness go up. And then the result of that would be maybe the overestimation of understanding wouldn't be quite as dramatic for some of the terms if they actually did have a fuller understanding of it and we just didn't capture it because they weren't motivated to put in as much effort.
Yeah. And this next question has to do with a little bit of the beginning processes that you went through. So choosing a topic for investigation can be a challenging process, especially for researchers that are just starting out. These could be junior researchers or graduate students. Could you share with us how you came to study jargon in biology education and essentially what inspired you to undertake this study?
Yeah. I tried to touch on this a little bit in my intro, but I'm happy to elaborate on it. So I think this particular project wouldn't have happened had we not done the prior project, which wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been introduced to this paper by Brown and Ryu, where they were looking at the effects of jargon on middle school students learning of photosynthesis. And we thought it was a really, really interesting study. And also at the time, we had been working very closely with instructors and also thinking about it in our own research, wanting our classes to be conceptual focused and problem solving, which I still do, and I'm completely on board with that. But then this idea like, hey, wait a second, the language, of course, that's so important. And we hadn't thought about it a lot. And there wasn't really anything out there about the impact of the jargon or just the language component of science learning in higher education. So we thought it was a great opportunity to start looking into it. And that's what led us to do that study where we disaggregated temporarily the concepts from the jargon.
Yeah.
See how that impacted learning. And yeah, so from that, we just actually one of the terms that had been flagged as potentially problematic from students based on instructor experience, it turned out it wasn't, that it seemed pretty intuitive to students. And that made us think, hey, we haven't really looked at this from the student perspective. We need to look at it more thoroughly. We don't want to guess what terms might be problematic for students. So that's what led us to this next study. And then just talking to instructors and looking at all the terms and starting to think about how we could, do they fit into different categories? It really evolved from that previous study and the awareness that we had after doing it.
Yeah. One of the themes of your findings was that students generally overestimated their own understanding of the terms, and particularly for the two categories, information and incompatible ambiguity. The article provided some recommendations for this, such as early testing for immediate feedback, and then embedding frequent opportunities for students to demonstrate their understanding of the vocabulary. So there's several questions in the chat as well about what educational practices do you think would be most beneficial for student learning jargon and why? And similar along those lines is, do you have any ideas for best engaging with students on these terms?
Yeah, so this is always a challenge. How do we take this and weave it into our courses? And I do think one of the lessons we learned from this is the need for awareness from both the students and instructors. Like, hey, actually, I'm struggling with this, or wow, I have a really good handle on this. And so not assuming about the knowledge. And maybe a lot of us have encountered the idea of using concept inventories early in the course to get a sense of where the students are and what concepts they're struggling with coming into the course. So we know we need to spend a bit more time on that together. And we could approach technical vocabulary in a very similar way. These are really important terms for communicating in this discipline. They're really important to understand what they mean, so you can use that understanding of the meaning to learn the new concepts we're going to learn. So doing similar pre-testing with the students and giving them feedback as well. And I think that feedback part is really important, because if terms seem really familiar to students, much like concepts can seem really familiar, and people start to tune out when they have that familiarity sense, then we need that instant feedback and the opportunity to reflect on it and correct it. So I think early testing with feedback could be really, really helpful. In terms of practices to help students learn the biology, so if you identify gaps, I think that using them is really powerful. Recognizing correct definitions can be helpful, but having to use them in a correct way to communicate an understanding of something. And so more opportunities for students to write explanations, which I realize can be very, very challenging in terms of providing feedback. But if there are opportunities here and there to have students write an explanation, and then, as an instructor, I would share with them, here are 3 example explanations. Let's talk about what's working and not working with these, to have them reflect on their own use of the language in their explanations. Also asking questions where they have to identify, are there any terms in this particular explanation that have been used incorrectly? And which ones, and how would you fix it? So that could be another way, like the reverse way to go about that, and maybe a little bit easier in terms of grading workload, if you're doing it for assessments that require grading.
Yeah, so along similar lines to that point, as opposed to asking students to define biology terms, instructors often design homework problems and then assignments in ways that require students to apply their knowledge to solve a problem. So this emphasis on problem solutions rather than recall was also present in the courses that were involved in the study. So in thinking about that format, what advice do you have for instructors designing assignments and exams as they try to gauge the level of understanding of their students for the terms?
Yeah, I think this is where it gets really challenging, because assessing students' ability to solve problems, and then also if you're trying to weave into are they using the language correctly, it really adds a lot of things that we're trying to check off on a list. So I think early on, when students are being introduced to new concepts, if we first I'm going to just take a step back from this because I think it has to do with answering this question, is that normalizing or making it part of our conversation that language is important for communicating our understanding. When you're solving problems, you're trying to communicate your understanding. You're trying to communicate, here, this is how I would solve that problem. And if we're not using the language properly, if we don't understand the language and we can't use it properly, that could make it seem like you don't know how, you haven't solved the problem, but actually you have, or you haven't applied the right concepts to the problem. So just having more conversations about the importance of language and then weaving that into talking about the problems, and also normalizing that it's a challenge to learn the language while you're also trying to learn how to solve problems. And if you see a term and you don't know what it is, let's talk about it. Or as an instructor, taking a step back and saying, oh yeah, hey, I'm noticing these 3 different terms here are being used, interchangeably. Let's talk about that. And then if that becomes part of the culture, that we value the language and the problem solving, then I think it's okay to also, when students are submitting their work related to solving problems, if they're using language incorrectly or it seems like they don't understand, then to flag that, and eventually there can be penalties for that, maybe if we need to add incentives to master the language as well. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So you discussed the challenges of learning jargon. And so this next sort of set of questions has to do with English language learners. So could you speak about the primary spoken language of these students? If you have this data, do different jargon categories confuse ESL students?
Yeah, so we did not collect any demographic data about the students related, well, any demographic data, including language status or language fluency. So I can't really speak to that. And from some of the background literature that we looked at related to this study, again, it wasn't necessarily related to always higher education, but there was some work for English language learners emphasizing the need to make meaning as opposed to superficial like memorization of jargon in terms of long-term retention. But I don't have enough information about the students that we surveyed to say, oh, these particular types of terms might be more challenging for English language learners. I think that's something that needs to be addressed for sure.
Yeah. You may have answered this question a little bit, but I was just curious if there's any resources available that you're aware of for English language learners. And if not, is there anything that we should focus on when trying to build those resources to help English language learners understand biology vocabulary or learn biology vocabulary?
Yeah, so I personally am not aware of certain tools that are directed at English language learners to learn technical vocabulary in biology. They might be out there. I know there's lots of study tools such as Quizlets and flashcards where students could use those. But again, if the goal is to make meaning of the terms and use them in a meaningful way, like when you're communicating science, then I think those are the opportunities that all students need. But of course, if anyone has suggestions about tools available to English language learners to learn biology, technical vocab, that'd be great to have.
Yeah. So the article nicely discussed the importance of jargon for developing a deep understanding of biology concepts. So in thinking about that goal of helping students learn biology jargon, what research would you like to see going forward into the future toward that goal?
I would like to see more about the intersection of writing and learning concepts and learning the language. If one of the goals of developing mastery of the language and mastery of the concepts is that you can communicate very effectively as well as you can understand other people's communication of science, I think writing can be a really powerful way to do that. When we have to explain something either verbally to a peer or in writing, and then if it's in writing and we have someone else reading it, it can become easier, I think, to see, oh, that doesn't quite make sense. And so the ideas that come from writing to learn pedagogy, and if we include the importance of the language in that, I think more opportunities to write, share with one another, get feedback both from peers and from instructors could be really helpful for both concepts and language. I'd like to see that investigated more.
Yeah. So I study motivation in science education, and I saw at least one intersection between the implications of your work and my own regarding the development of a science identity. So research has found that seeing oneself as a science person is important for retention in biology, as well as other related majors as well. One way that students can begin to identify with science might be tied to whether they can use science words accurately, talk about science topics with others in their daily lives, answer other people's questions about science, and then potentially have other people recognize them or see their expertise as they're doing this with science topics. So what I was curious about what you think of this connection between students demonstrating mastery of biology jargon, among others, and then their development of a science identity.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. I think it's something that's really important. And this was one of the frameworks that Brown and Ryu introduced in their 2008 paper, again, when they were looking at jargon in middle school students. And they talked about discursive identity. So how we choose to speak like a particular person, or who we believe someone to be after we hear them speak, and the role of language in culture, and as you've mentioned, in identity. So if you have students entering into a jargon heavy learning situation, that can create a conflict with identity if they don't perceive that discourse, the written components, the spoken components, the figures, if they perceive those to be a cultural representation, and they do not see themselves as part of that culture, like that represents STEM culture. I don't think I can speak that way or communicate that way, then that creates that conflict of identity, which can reduce the engagement and the learning. So I do think that's really important. And I do wonder how much of an impact that might have on students at different stages in their career. So younger students versus high school students, and college and university students. I think that would be really interesting to look at. So I do think that giving opportunities for students to develop the skills and see themselves as competent at communicating biology could potentially really positively contribute to identity. And becoming part of that science community and using the discourse. So yeah, I think finding more ways for us in our courses to help students develop that communication and show them, like, look, you're communicating, you can make sense of this stuff, and you're part of this discourse community.
Yeah. I'm switching over to the chat now. So one person was curious about whether, or wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about the disaggregation of jargon and concepts to improving learning.
Yeah, so the study that we were inspired by did a longer term project where it was over multiple weeks that students were introduced to the concepts related to photosynthesis that they needed to learn. And they had swapped out all what they decided were jargon terms for, basically, instead of a single word, it would be an explanation of that thing using everyday language, or what language that they thought the students would be more comfortable with. And so they did that over multiple weeks, and then they scaffolded in the language after the students had a chance to encounter and work with the concepts. And then at the end, they did some testing on concepts and jargon. What we did in the undergraduate biology class was a much shorter term intervention, where in this particular course, the students would do pre-readings before class about the things that we're going to discuss in class. And so we had a control group that got the normal pre-reading with the jargon terms in there. And in the treatment group, we swapped out what we perceived to be some of the jargon terms, problematic terms, for explanations using more common language. And so they had those two different pre-readings. They took a little quiz related to the pre-reading to make sure they got some key messages from it. And then in the lecture class following that, the control group was introduced to some content related to the topic. The treatment group was introduced to the jargon terms and to match it up with the information they had learned in the pre-reading. And then after that, they both got active learning class and a post-test. So it was a really short intervention, a very quick disaggregation, and then adding it on top. And it was in the post-test when they had to solve some problems and explain their answers, that the disaggregated group showed more correct explanations.
Yeah. One person mentioned that it would be really interesting to look at jargon in terms of whether terms are concrete, hypothetical, or theoretical. And they referenced Anton Lawson's work. Do you believe this might provide some explanation for why there are differences in difficulty?
I do, yeah. So the idea of certain things being more concrete and having sort of these previous or a more tangible model of understanding about it, I think would make certain terms easier to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not familiar with the particular work that was just cited. I'm curious about it. I'll have to look it up. But I do think that has something to do with it for sure. And that could relate back to the molecular terms, you know, things that are more abstract. We have a less concrete idea of what it is. Even visualizing it and everything makes it harder to learn and use.
Yeah. How do you differentiate understanding the term from understanding the concept? Do you think that there is a difference between the two?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that I do think students could have an understanding of a concept without a full understanding of some of the terms. I'd have to dig a little deeper into that in terms of, I'd be curious to hear how the student, you know, works with a concept. You know, can they work with it correctly, but they still struggle with the term. So maybe it's very possible, I'm sure, a lot of the time that students have an understanding based on their own experiences or previous experiences, but it's not the way that we are typically used to hearing it used or seeing it used or in writing, for example. So maybe we overlook those understandings because they're not using the language. I hope that addresses that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a similar question about distinguishing concepts from definitions, because tubulin is not a concept.
No, it's not a concept. Yeah.
This is a brief clarification question. At what point in the semester did students take the survey?
Yeah, so this was at the end of the semester, before the final exam. So during that kind of last week of class, so in theory, in practice, they had been introduced to the terms. They had been used all quarter or semester, sorry. So they should have had exposure to them for a number of weeks.
Yeah. Does high school curricula have to be revised to assert these deficiencies?
I guess I'm curious because I'm not very well connected with high school curriculum, so I don't know what emphasis is placed on developing a mastery of the language or having conversations about the role of language in learning science and communicating science. I think if it's similar to what I've experienced in higher education, where that's not happening a lot of the time, then probably, yeah, we need to look at where are there other gaps where students could be introduced to the role of technical vocabulary and more scaffolding strategies to master it so that they come better equipped to use it. But I do think there's still some of the responsibility falls on higher education, of course, too.
Yeah. To better determine students actually understand a concept or definition, have you tried asking students to use the term in an explanation?
Yeah, so I think that's a great way to start to get a better handle on how they think about that term. And I personally prefer having them use it in an explanation to start to get a sense of what they know and don't know and where they're struggling.
One person was curious if there were any particularly funny or wrong definitions that you can share.
Oh gosh. Wrong. I mean, there were wrong ones for sure. I think it's probably not funny. It's more interesting. One thing that struck me when I was looking through some of the definitions not so long ago was one of the words was frequency, and this is where I think context actually has a lot to do with it. So the students were presented with this word, and it was on the survey that came from genetics. And a lot of them were talking about recombination, because I think they were thinking about recombination frequency. And so I think it's not funny. It's not really wrong. It's just the role of context in the way that they're thinking about, well, what kind of frequency are you talking about here? Are you talking about recombination frequency, or the frequency, how often something happens in a period of time, which would be the simplest definition. The context really matters.
Yeah. Do you think your results would be different if you asked students to identify a correct or incorrect use of a term using different examples? I'm thinking that novices may be better at understanding terms in context, or follow your survey questions with contextual questions and see whether their vocabulary understanding would improve as they work through these. I'm thinking of doing this for my students and giving them feedback on answers.
Yeah, I definitely think having that context, and so you have that surrounding information to decide, hey, wait a second, that doesn't quite make sense. That's not how it should be used, or that's not how I'm used to seeing it used. I think that would, and that's more representative of what they're going to have to do anyway, right? We don't often just start rambling off definitions. We're using them to communicate something about something else. So I think putting it in a passage and either having them use it correctly in a passage or identify when it is being used correctly would be a better realistic scenario.
Yeah. One person was interested in your comment about there having been limited work in this area in higher education. There has been quite a lot of research looking at language in science and word meaning in school science, going back at least about 4 decades now. This includes looking at ambiguous terms, for example. Is there perhaps a lack of cross-fertilization across phases where research from the school level may be assumed irrelevant to the university level and vice versa?
Yeah, so I agree that there is a lot of work that's been done in sort of the K to 12 fields, and there is some work done in higher education for sure. But I think this cross-fertilization, this looking back to the K to 12, and maybe there is sometimes a dismissive nature, like, well, that's K to 12, that doesn't matter here. And that's when we first encountered that paper about the middle school students learning photosynthesis. And that's when we got to talking, like, hey, why wouldn't it be relevant at this level? We're still learning new concepts. We're still learning new jargon. We might have developed more skills as learners. And so maybe the challenges are less sometimes, but we don't know until we look at it. So I think looking back through the K to 12 and figuring out, where it might be appropriate to study those things also in our higher education populations would be a great thing to do.
Yeah. One person said that you mentioned pre-reading, which a lot of us use, but often relying on the textbook.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for using the textbook, which typically has a lot of jargon, as part of the pre-class preparation, if we should be working to disaggregate jargon?
Yeah, so my colleagues and I have talked about this a bit before, because when we did that disaggregation study, we sort of translated the textbook, removing the jargon, and that's not sustainable. So I think sometimes, ideas we've come up with is, well, one, establishing early on a culture in the course. Hey, when you're doing a reading, you're going to encounter a lot of jargon, and talking very explicitly, trying to understand the jargon and the concept at the same time can reduce our capacity to do those things. So take a step back as the reader, identify the terms you're confused about, look those up, figure them out, then come back to the reading, sort of this iterative process. So make that a normal culture in the class. Or, also providing students with a list. Hey, these are the jargon terms you're probably going to encounter. Here's a place where you can find the information about them. And again, just, maybe take some time to focus on the terms a little bit, do the reading, come back to the terms to connect your understanding of those terms to what you just read. Those are just a couple things that I think we can do if we're still using the textbooks.
Yeah. Before I move on to the next question, I do see that people are asking about English language learners or English speakers, or when they don't speak English as their primary language. And you already mentioned that you already sort of answered these questions, and that it's not a particular area of expertise for you. but I just wanted to mention that one person dropped a resource in the chat that seems to be very helpful for Spanish language speakers. So if you are curious, you can check that out. Moving on to the next question. Oh, no. Epitope is an immunological concept. Was there any reason to suppose that the students had to be introduced to antibody-target interactions? Did you consider how or whether the terms were used in the courses the students took?
Yeah, so epitope did surprise us when we looked at the results, and we went back to the instructional team like, hey, just double checking this was used, and it was used when talking about different experimental results and talking about different experiments, that the students would have to look at the results of those experiments and analyze them and discuss them. But the instructors did reflect that they might not have fully explained it, what it meant. I mean, we have the evidence from students to suggest that might not have happened. So it was part of the course, but I think it wasn't emphasized enough.
Mm-hmm. Are there any strategies to control for jargon misunderstanding when assessing a concept or process? Do you recommend surveying our students for jargon understanding before the start of the course?
Yeah, I think just like checking if students have some background knowledge about concepts, it would be good to see if they have some background knowledge or what their performance is at using certain jargon terms correctly or identifying when they're used correctly. And that might be a helpful piece of knowledge as an instructor to say, hey, we need to take some time on the language here too.
Yeah. This next one is a methodological question. Having students express a correct definition assumes things like language facility as well as jargon understanding.
Mm-hmm.
What do you suppose would happen if you reran the study with multiple choice definitions questions rather than open-ended questions?
Yeah, I do think the scores would go up a little bit, that students would be better able to recognize correct definitions, especially when they're in contrast to less correct definitions of the term. If so, the forced choice, the multiple choice option would increase scores for correctness as opposed to having them explain it.
Mm-hmm. I find some definitions are different in the literature. For example, what one might consider to be an organelle may be different, and students Googling info, etc., would have a different experience of the term for a different student. How do you tackle those LAOS interpretation of some definitions?
Yeah, I think this is a challenge, not just with information they have access to on the internet, but even from course to course or discipline to discipline, we might use terms slightly differently. And so I think if we're looking at how students understand certain terms and use them, and we're flagging, oh, these ones are troublesome, and then trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? Is it because they just don't understand, or because they understand it in a different way from a different context? So I think it really just involves us having to do a little bit more digging to understand the root of the problem so that we can address it in our course. Hey, have you ever noticed that this term is used in two different ways? It's used this way in this discipline, and here in this class we're using it this way, and that's not because I'm trying to trick you, it's just a normal thing that happens. So more digging and having more conversations.
Mm-hmm. This next question is about how you do this in your own practice. So how do these results now influence your teaching with respect to jargon?
I do have more explicit conversations with my students about the jargon that we're encountering, and I do much more often than I used to stop and say, hey, here's what this term means in this context, and here's how we use it, and here's an example of how it's being used incorrectly. I also have incorporated a lot more writing into my classes as a way for students to gain practice communicating about their understanding and using the language correctly, and identifying like, okay, you've used gene here, but that's not actually the correct term, and here's why. So, and having conversations about the importance of that in communication, not because I'm being nitpicky, but because words have meaning, and your understanding is lost if you're using the wrong terms or you're using them incorrectly.
There's a running joke in science education that we teach more new vocabulary than a first-year foreign language course. Do you think that is true?
I've also seen that, and we included that in our paper. So I guess I don't know if it's true. I do think there's a ton of jargon, and so even if it's not true, it's still something that we need to be mindful of.
Have you looked at how much jargon experts understand? When I
Oh,
read the primary literature, I've learned how to infer meaning from words that I don't know, especially when reading across different areas in biology. I suspect I miss a lot of jargon. I think experts could be really cool comparison group.
yeah, that's a great point. That would be. I haven't looked at that, but I do think that's interesting, and I think it also touches upon something else, though, and that's um, experts versus novices' comfort with not knowing something and knowing when they need to know. Right? So if you encounter a jargon term, when do you decide, oh, wait, I really need to learn what that means so I can figure out what's going on here? Versus novices might not always be as good at identifying when it's okay to not know and when they really need to figure it out, and helping them identify those moments might be helpful.
Yeah. Were you able to compare the students' responses to your questions on vocabulary that would not be considered jargon as a means of establishing a baseline for student ability to determine, to define terms accurately?
Okay, that's a good point. So we didn't survey them on other terms out of these lists that we thought, oh, they should definitely be able to explain these as a metric of how good are they at explaining. No, we didn't do that. That's a great point, though. I appreciate that.
One second.
Yeah, of course.
The ambiguous terms are easily confused with common vernacular. Are terms without this type of confusion more accurately predicted by the students?
So they had really high perceived understanding of those terms as well as some of the others, but they did not always have high correct explanations of what they meant. But the explanations they gave for the ambiguous terms, we were surprised that they weren't using them in what we might consider the sort of everyday vernacular usage. They were just omitting parts of it. So in our context, for the terms we gave in the ambiguous category, there didn't seem to be a widespread confusion of using the everyday language meaning of them.
One person was wondering if you could speak more to the way we teach language in biology as compared to the way we teach foreign language. So some studies have found that the average introductory biology course actually has more new terms than the average introductory foreign language. We talked about this already. Yet the way we introduce students to those terms and use them is quite different. Are there other ways that we should be using the jargon, not just defining it?
I think so. I'm not familiar with how foreign languages are taught, so I can't say if this is how it's done, but making meaning of things is really important to have a firmer understanding of them. And so I don't think the focus should be necessarily on defining them, but using them to communicate. And so where is this term used correctly? Where is it used incorrectly? Being able to identify those, being able to connect it to things they already know, so that it becomes part of their way of thinking about and communicating about whatever topic or concepts they're learning.
Have you analyzed exactly what it means to learn photosynthesis at the middle school level compared to what it would mean at the college level?
I have not analyzed. No. So I don't actually teach photosynthesis myself, but from my colleagues I know that do, they say that university students struggle with it a lot. So I'm sure there's a role for the cognitive load of jargon and the information related to photosynthesis there.
We often assume that all biologists would agree on definitions, but we have observed that some students confuse confusion comes from how biology faculty themselves use and understand biology jargon differently across different courses in our departmental curriculum. So how do you predict experts might perform on a task like this? Are you going to measure this in a future study?
Yeah, I think future studies should have experts, taking it as well to see how much agreement or disagreement there is in, oh, this constitutes, or this is how I would use it and explain it, to get a better handle on the variation that is happening in our classrooms. And that might also explain some of the variation we see in student understanding. I think the expert perspective would be a nice piece to add.
Yeah, other people are also curious about that. They really want to see how science faculty would do with this type of study. Let's see. Okay. I believe we've answered all of the questions.
Do you want me to share the last slide then?
Yes, please. Well, that concludes our session for today. I just want to briefly thank Lisa and Ashanti and also the participants for submitting those questions and being actively engaged in today's discussion. And then finally, I'd like to remind you all to keep an eye out for summer and fall webinar dates. They'll be posted on the website. Thank you so much. Bye. Have a nice day.
Thanks, Jeanette. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.